Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Cyber Talk with Nikolay. And today's episode, we call it Think Like a Threat Actor, Respond Like a Seasoned Security Professional. So, in studio, we have with us Malcolm Harkins. He's going to help us to understand a little bit more how we can do certain things certain way and accomplish a lot more than we have been able to in the past. But before I turn over to him and start asking him his questions, I'd like to give you a little bit of introduction to where we're heading with this title. So if you looked at the Verizon data breach report for the past year, there were numerous incidents happening in 2021. So Verizon reported that 4,862 incidents occurred and 1,384 of them with confirmed data disclosure. So most attacks happened in 100% external threat actors coming in. So one question would come to mind: how come we still in 2021 have so many incidents occurring from attackers trying to penetrate environments and get to the data, what they're using, and what we're doing wrong as cybersecurity professionals, that we're not always successful in detecting them and responding to the incidents? So that's essentially the conversation that we're going to have today with Malcolm. And he's also part of a company called Epiphany, and we'll talk about it. So it's something that we potentially could be useful in our tool set and understand. But my basic question is, when we have so many tools and you can look right now into the space of EDR, for instance, and probably you will be able to find hundreds, not even thousands, different endpoint protection and detection mechanisms and software out there that you can deploy. But at the end, the question still remains: if you deploy all those various tools, have you actually achieved better sense of security and you have better posture than without them? Or have you achieved them in a way, or have you deployed them in a way that they actually provide you strategic advantage against threat actors? So with that said, I'm gonna turn over to Malcolm with first little question. Talk a little bit. I'm sorry. Talk a little bit about yourself and also give a little bit introduction into Epiphany, and then we can start going through the questions and understand a little bit better what we can do to change the game. So Malcolm, it's on to you.
Thanks, Nikolay. As you mentioned, I'm with Epiphany Systems. I'm Chief Security and Trust Officer. Been with the company since before it launched a little over a year ago, going into Black Hat last year. Prior to that, I spent a little bit of time in the web application security space. I was also Chief Security and Trust Officer at Silence, that many of you might know, that was acquired by BlackBerry a couple years ago. And then prior to that, I spent a few decades, almost 24 years with Intel Corporation, most of that running security. So I was Chief Security and Privacy Officer, so I oversaw all the traditional information security related items, but also all the compliance related activities associated with technology and information. I oversaw corporate emergency management, and then I oversaw also product security, and not the feature scale, but the security development lifecycle and privacy by design aspects that we use to manage Intel's products and try and minimize vulnerabilities or issues with regard to that technology that we're putting out into the marketplace.
Got it. Thank you, Malcolm, for the intro, and thank you for being on the talk show. So let's just dig into the subject and try to understand it a little bit better from your perspective with all those controls that we have in place. What essentially Epiphany, the premise, what Epiphany can do, and how we can help our security professionals to do things better and understand what they can do and where. Because I think in my mind, everything is about strategic placement of controls and contextualizing the data that flows through those systems and understanding it's just having more systems is not going to really achieve the level of security that you want to achieve. You just spend a lot more money. And I think people used to joke about it. It's not defense in depths, it's expense in depths. So it's essentially, we try to find this balance where you can spend less money but have more effective controls in place. So would you mind sharing some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that. I actually coined that back several years ago. How defense in depth has led to expense in depth, because we we continue to throw money at capabilities. So for me, expense and depth, if you want to, let's just peel the onion there first. For me, the definition of that is a culture of controls where instead of getting rid of the technologies and processes that are not working, we add more to make up for the failings of the controls that we have. So we continue to stack on more and more and more. Now, that's beneficial for the security industry that profits from the insecurity of computing, who sells yet another capability. But in many cases, we have, I'd say, in ignoring emerging technology areas where we might need new capabilities, we might need new tooling, and in some organizations that might be underfunded. So if we put that off to the side and you think of a lot of organizations, we have, in many cases, adequate controls in place. Like you said, you mentioned advanced endpoint. There's advanced network detection. People have multi-factor authentication. They have patching capabilities. They have identity access management. So, we have a lot of what I'll say observation technologies that observe what's going on in the environment and help us try and figure out what's what. We have a lot of action-oriented technologies, endpoint and other things that try and act upon issues and mitigate those issues before they become material in the environment. But when you build out this, what I'm talking about is called an OODA loop, and you can go look it up. It's a military term for observation, orient, decision, and act. But what we're lacking in many ways is orientation and decision-making capabilities. Our environments are constantly evolving. Configurations are constantly happening. We've got all the externalities of vulnerabilities and threat actors and threat agent, but we don't really know day to day where we're exploitable, and more importantly, what we can do to address that exploitability in our enterprise. We deal with things at an attack surface level and all the vulnerability management things. But what I've learned over the years is the fact that there's a difference between being vulnerable and being exploitable. They're not the same thing. I can be vulnerable, but not exploitable. And what we've started seeing this a little bit in the industry, and CISO has done a good job, I think, of creating their list and focusing on what's being exploitable in the wild, but that's still at a component level, a foothold level focus. Again, that surface. And what I'm talking about is really the depth of the attack, the exploitability of the enterprise from something at the surface to the material event, the exposure. So when you think of Epiphany, in many ways, one way to think about it is we're an exposure management capability. We're ingesting from your other tooling, your vulnerability scanners, your endpoint data, some network type items, identity things like Active Directory or Okta. And with the ingestion of that, the machine learning that we've built, in essence, routes. It's a routing capability. It's a mapping technology. Think of it like an evil Google map. We start with the destination, the prize, the thing that would create the material event, the thing that the attacker would want to go after. And we're building the attack paths that exist in your enterprise so that you can actually see where you can take action to break the attack path. And then when you do that, how many other associated attack paths are eliminated. And then from there, the byproduct is, in essence, vulnerability prioritization, because we can go from that destination of the attacker. And while we might be reducing the attacker opportunities inside because we're making changes based upon what Epiphany is telling you, we can also show you the vulnerabilities at the surface level that are the likely ones that would be used for a foothold. So you can patch those first. Take Log4j as an example. Instead of what I know a lot of peers did, they churned for days, if not a week or so, with several people, then out to other teams and stuff. So you had enrolled in this debate discussion of where is it? What do we do with it? Where is it going to bite us in the ass? What's the priority? When many of them just said after a week or so of that churn and not knowing where to focus and what to do, we got to patch it all. Well, what we could do is say, as an example, what are the 50 instances of log4j that are in the path to an exploitable event that's going to cause a material risk to your organization? That's the areas that you need to be taking action on as soon as those things occur. And so we can, with precision, pinpoint not only the vulnerability you need to worry about, the device that it's on, the identity that would be associated in an attack, but again, that lateral movement that could occur within your environment, but by and large, we don't focus on. We just do all this spray and pray vulnerability hygiene things rather than going, let's dig underneath that and understand really where I'm exploitable once the foothold is there, because all we're doing is dealing again at this surface level, which I'm not saying we will end up stopping doing that, but with more precision, we can deal with the surface level vulnerabilities that matter most, and then really dig into the depth of the enterprise and understanding the context of those exploitable pivot points that lead to a material event.
Got it. No, that's thank you, Malcolm, for that, and it's extremely helpful and useful and to understand. And I think you touched upon a lot of things in your response to a simple question about the company. And certainly, I think the audience will appreciate that. And one of the things that I'm also a big proponent on when you describe the vulnerabilities. Yeah, I may be vulnerable, but I may not be exploitable. It's two completely different things, and most of the time people just run all those scans for vulnerability, and they find a bunch of vulnerabilities, and it's like, oh my god, we have thousands and thousands. What we're gonna do? The life is ending right here. So how are we gonna be able to patch all of this? And but yes, Fluff,
The business around,
right.
do we really need to do that? Can we do it later? Can we do it now? Or they just blindly accept what the vendor community, or again, I love what CIS is doing, but if following what CIS is doing will make a difference in reduction of the efforts on where you focus, but it's still very, very broad based and not precise enough as to know where specifically in your enterprise you need to take action.
Right, and that's also kind of like you can add internal auditors and external auditors when they come and look at the vulnerability reports, and then they rub your nose in the dirt and say, "Why didn't you fix all of that? We're gonna write you up, and here's 30 days to fix it." So I think what I see interesting thing that coming out from your platform is and maybe it will help audience to understand a little bit better. How does your platform learn about all those things and to connect dots? And I think probably if you look at Bruce Schneider, when I forgot the name of the book he wrote back in the day, when he was explaining how all those connections being made, ifs and statements and everything else, and the more you have it, the more complicated system becomes and much harder to test. So the vulnerabilities are inevitable, but putting those in a context and learning from all those things and bringing it to the table to say, well, there are a million different things you can go wrong, but here is one particular thing that 100% is going to go wrong, and rather in a hurry, because all those things come in the context. So how does your system contextualize this one and understands the environment? And I think more important also, how does it know which threat actor is going to go against which vulnerability in the system and connect those dots to say, hey, company A, you need to really, really be proactive on this particular thing because you're about to get exposed.
Yeah, great question. So, as I mentioned, the machine learning capability that we built, because of the data that we're ingesting, we understand the relationships, we understand the context between the identity, the device, the network segments, the applications, and that machine learning capability. If the route exists, we'll start displaying it, and we do variations on those routes so that we can kind of compress them into an aggregate view. One, to make it simpler, and then two, to say if you take this action, not only do you break this route, you break 4,000 other variants of this route. Now, when you start looking at it from, again, that surface level, the folks who built the technology for us are offensive folks by their background. Red teamers, penetration testers, and folks that did offensive work in many cases in the government back in their early days in their careers. So they think like an attacker. And so with that knowledge and perspective, you think about it, the attacker wants the least amount of noise, the fastest path, and the least amount of friction to get potentially in their way, and they don't want to be caught, right? Much no different than a Google Maps. What's the most expeditious route to get from Folsom, California to San Francisco, right? And do those routes potentially have variations around them? We're basically doing something similar. And so with that, we have a very precise ability to determine and show you those routes. And then with the knowledge that we've embedded into the machine learning capability, as an example, if there was a Zoom vulnerability that had a memory exploit and you had, let's say, Silence, I'm familiar with it because I was at Silence for a number of years, but didn't have memory protection turned on, well, we understand the configuration and the setting because we're ingesting from the endpoint. So we know what might get past it relative to the vulnerabilities that exist. And so if you don't have memory protection turned on, and you've got a vulnerability in Zoom, and you got 40 people that are using Zoom, and those 40 people out of the 40,000, when you pop those systems, have through the daisy chain of identities, networks, embedded group permissions, configurations that you don't know about, lead to a point of compromise that creates a material event. Again, we start from the inside out. So we start from that material event out. And then we can say, hey, here's the vulnerabilities in Zoom, and here's the 40 people that likely would be hit by it. And again, you factor in the CISO list. Is it being actively exploited? Okay, well, if it is, then you have a reasonable approximation that those systems at that surface level need to be addressed. But even if you do that, and this is where it drives me nuts with what we've been doing for so long, we'll deal with those type of things, but we never address, and you remember this, we used to talk about the hard crunchy outside and then the squishy inside.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? We still do the same damn thing. All we're doing is perimeter level defense work. Now, what Epiphany can do is make that perimeter level defense work more precise because of what we're focusing you on. But more importantly, we're showing you that squishy inside and the configurations, the group permissions, the identities, the network segmentations that you don't know in real time, all the time, what's being moved around and what's causing things to create exploitable conditions. We show you those because we're ingesting. And so the system, depending upon how often you scan, updates from your other things, it's updating the attack paths every couple hours to probably at least once a day across your environment to those critical devices, identities, applications, and data that, again, would cause a material event for your organization.
Interesting, and I think you mentioned one interesting thing that I was going to ask, and you kind of queued it up to it. As far as like running your system, you mentioned you can do it a couple times a day or every 2 hours or whatever have you. How intensive are what impact is going to create on the environment? Because it's not vulnerability scanner, so it doesn't really go and actively tries to poke on every system and figure it out whether it's wrong or right. So it takes data from all already contextualized environment that you're receiving from various telemetries in the environment, and then you're connecting them together. So how would you describe how long does it take, or how often somebody's supposed to run it, and what results they need to expect, or how
Yeah,
do you address the changing environment? Let's say in case if you have 30,000 endpoints or 30,000 people working in the environment. So how
yeah,
effective system in situations like that?
yeah. Great question. So we're not a scanner. So we're not actively doing anything in your environment that impacts any level of system performance. We ingest from APIs. And so any updates to our technology, which is constantly, in essence, in operation and running, if your vulnerability scanner scans once a week, that's when that would get updated. If your endpoint capability is updating, I'll make it up, twice a day, that would get updated. Any configuration issues that get changed, as those relationships and the context between the devices, the identities, the network, the applications change, we would update. So as often as your environment is changing, we would update. If your world was completely static and you only did a vulnerability scan once a month, your endpoint was frozen and you never did anything different with it, and your network never changed, and identities never changed, and you never added a new user, nobody ever left the company, then the attack path would be relatively static. But that's not reality, right? There's add move changes all the time, devices, applications, identities. There's network ports and other things that are being changed all the time. There's vulnerabilities that are getting announced all the time. And then the question just becomes for